If ever you wanted an example of the notion of unintended consequences, here you have it. The last thing that the United States' neocon foreign policy establishment wanted was to strengthen Russia. They seem to have decided that Russia is the great problem in the world and that they would concentrate on weakening Russia. That's a major part, not only of the war in Ukraine, but particularly of the economic side of it. Sanctions program of stopping purchases of oil and gas by Europe from Russia. Russia provided the cheapest oil and gas that Europe could have found anywhere. Because of the cheapness, European products were lower priced. They didn't have to raise the price as much because they got the cheap energy. And that made European economy successful, competitive, able to export, which the engine of European growth has been Germany, above all, as an exporter. All of that was undercut when the sanctions went into effect in order to weaken Russia. But they didn't work. And they didn't work for two reasons that will help everyone understand why BRICS is so important. The first reason is that Russia was able to turn to its BRICS partners with whom Russia had been developing relationships for many years. BRICS wasn't an organization formed last year or the year before. It's older, and Russia had cultivated in lots of ways relationship with India, China, South Africa, Brazil. And so they bought Russian oil and gas. To make a complex story short and sweet, Russia turned out to be strengthened. The second unintended consequence was that Russia strengthened itself by turning to the BRICS, but it was a two-way arrangement. In order for India and China to buy the oil and gas from Russia, they had to work out the economics of this enormous business imposed on them by the sanctions levied by the United States and its G7 Europe allies. And so the BRICS became better coordinated, more dependent one on the other, more having their economies intertwined. Bottom line, Russia and the BRICS became stronger, and the United States became less powerful because of it, more isolated because of their own decisions to have the war in Ukraine. And that isolation of the United States is now deepening because of its decision to be as supportive unilaterally to Israel as they have decided to be. The unintended consequence of trying to isolate Russia has been to isolate the United States. The world has changed, and the United States is denying that to its own detriment. China is coming closer and closer to being an economic equivalent of the United States, and its alliance, now accounting for nearly half of the population of this planet, is going to overtake and surpass the United States, which is 4.5% of the population of this planet. The unique position of the United States as dominant coming out of World War II couldn't possibly have lasted forever. It was a delusion to imagine it. And all that's happening now is the foreseeable reality that the rest of the world has caught up, has figured out how to grow fast, catch up to the United States, surpass it. That was in the cards from day one, should have been planned for, wasn't, should have been understood, wasn't, should have been discussed and debated in the United States, wasn't. And I leave it to you all to understand that in our presidential race coming to its culmination now, there is virtually no discussion of what is probably the most important economic issue facing this country, which is how do we cope with, how do we work with How do we live with the decline of the American empire, the decline of American capitalism, the rise of other capitalist economic and other systems around the world? That's what we're going to have to figure out. That is the issue we face. And denial, dealing, for example, with this BRICS conference in Russia as if it were a Russian event, as if it were all about Mr. Putin. It wasn't. It isn't. That's the same denial. You can't see what's going on because you have to rewrite it as the old Cold War struggle of the United States versus Russia. It's not only tiresome, it leads you to make catastrophic mistakes, like the war in Iraq, like the policies in the Middle East, and indeed everything else coming down the pike, so long as one of the two superpowers pretends that it's not one of two superpowers. It's pathetic and dangerous to watch. The economic growth of the United States for this year is scheduled to be 2.8%. Let me ask everyone, keep that in your mind, 2.8% growth, and that's faster than any one of the other of the G7. Okay, now let me compare that first to Russia. Their economic growth rate, by the way, all these numbers come from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, a Western institution dominated by the G7. Russia's growth in 2024, 3.9%. Let's turn next to China, 4.8%. That's almost double the economic growth rate of the United States this year. And then we come to India, which is 7%, almost triple the level of the United States. And I wouldn't bring you these numbers for 1 year if they weren't, in fact, the kinds of numbers we have seen for decades. That's why the Chinese are where they are. They caught up. They grew faster. They figured out how to raise the standard of living of their people much faster than anyone ever did before. This is not an endorsement of the Chinese economy or society or suggesting they don't have lots of problems. They do. All countries do. But when it comes to economic growth, that's their strong suit, folks. And that's what makes the difference in the world economy, doesn't it? To pretend that this isn't going on, that this isn't suggesting where the future lies, of course they have a good humor among themselves at their conference. They are the growing, dynamic core of the world economy now. The West isn't. And that's not about to change. That's why you have to come to terms with it, rather than pretending that such situations don't exist or that it's all about Mr. Putin. It isn't. Let me remind you of another statistic. The GDP of the United States remains number one in the world, somewhere between $25 and $30 trillion a year. That's the legacy of being the dominant economy for the last century. What is the GDP of Russia, our so-called enemy? 2 trillion, maybe 3. People should understand Russia has never been an economic threat to the United States. It can't be. It's too small. It may have a powerful military, but economically, not at all. The United States could, if it worked out an arrangement, easily come to terms with an economy that's so much smaller. The Chinese economy, that's a completely different thing. Their GDP is around $17, $18 trillion, catching up, exactly. And Russia and China together, and India and Brazil added, yeah, that gives you the powerhouse that I've been describing and that BRICS represents. The road forward with continued denial is a road into making mistakes. Let me remind everyone, at the beginning of the war in 2022, there were predictions from the president on down. Russia would be destroyed. Russia would fall to its knees. The ruble would collapse. Russia would become dismembered. Putin would be ejected. None of that happened. Why? because they didn't understand BRICS, what it meant, what it could do, how it could intervene with Russia to change the outcome. More such mistakes are coming if you continue to pretend that we're all in some old Cold War 2.0 rather than in a new economic situation. Look, I do understand. I'm an American citizen, born here, lived here, worked here all my life. It is very hard to be in the period of decline of an empire. I'm sure it was hard for the British who lost their empire a century ago, and it was hard for the Dutch and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, but we do have the benefit of knowing that and making at least some choices to accept it, to understand it, and to work out a live and let live with the rest of the world. Otherwise, the doom and gloom predictions of World War III and all the forms that is taking will in the end overtake us. Not because they have to happen, not because they're built into the system, but rather because a population having to face the decline of its empire, the decline of its system, wants to deny it rather than treat it in the manner that adults kind of know they ought to do. At the end of the war, the United States had had one experience with bombs falling on its territory. That was Pearl Harbor at the beginning. Never again. No damage was done here. No explosions happened. No invasion occurred. None of it. We lost some troops, but relatively much less than other countries. Meanwhile, all the potential competitors of the United States, Germany and Japan, the losers of World War II, but even Britain, France, Italy, they were all defeated. Their factories were bombed, their railroads wrecked, all the rest of it. So we came out a unique position. We held that unique position for most of the rest of the 20th century, the second half of that century, when we could do pretty much what we wanted. It didn't matter. We were so dominant, the economic system here. We helped the others rebuild from the war in Japan, in Western Europe, and so on. And we could do what we wanted. They had this notion that you're kind of alone in the world, that everybody has to adjust to you. That's over. And now it won't work. I'm going to explain why these tariffs are a mistake, as if you were in the position you were before. So I will slap you with a tariff and I will not suffer consequences. This is completely wrong. I'm going to give you the example. Electric vehicles. They are the vehicles of the future. Between the damage to our health and the damage to the resource base of this planet, burning fossil fuels to move our cars and trucks is on the way out. It's going to be replaced not by the rational decision, that would be mass transportation, but by the irrational but profitable decision to substitute electric vehicles for fossil fuel burning vehicle. Given that, here's the reality. The Chinese participated, along with the Europeans and the Americans, over the last 15 years to produce a profitable electric vehicle. That competition has been won by the Chinese, above all by a particular company, BYD. And if you don't know what that company is, that's a sign of denying what's going on in the world. In this case, by the mass media who haven't told you about it. BYD produces the highest quality, lowest price electric car and truck. Bingo, there it is. They're selling it all over the world, including Europe, by the way. But you won't find those vehicles on the roads in the United States today. Why? Because there's currently a 100% tariff. What that means is if the car costs $30,000 bringing it in from China, you and I would have to pay $60,000 to buy it. 30 to the Chinese manufacturer and 30 to Uncle Sam, because that's what the tariff is, a tax. Here's what that means, my fellow Americans. All over the world, every company that makes things that compete with American products, companies that make shirts, companies that make food, companies that make software programs. They make anything. They all have to buy cars and trucks. It's part of their business. They're going to get the best quality, cheapest electric truck, and that will be reflected in low prices for what they produce. In contrast, Americans who have to pay way more for those electric trucks with the big tariff will charge much more for their products than their foreign competitors, and they'll lose business. And you and I will lose our jobs. Why? Because of the tariff. So this may sound good. It may look like you're being a tough guy, Mr. Trump, but what you're doing is playing a silly political game that will come back and bite you and me where it hurts.